Humanity had long believed it lived under a stable and fair system. The Council, a group that claimed to oversee peace and order, had maintained authority for decades. Most people had learned to trust them. They thought the Council made decisions for everyone's safety, managing resources and mediating disputes between nations and communities. At least that was the story people were told. Life carried on in a rhythm that felt ordinary to those living it. Markets opened at the same time every day. Children went to schools and offices hummed with the quiet noise of people performing their jobs. Streets were familiar, homes were familiar, and even the small routines of daily life gave people a sense of security. For a long time it seemed as if everything was as it should be. But beneath the surface, cracks had started to appear. People began noticing small, unusual things, details that didn't quite fit the narrative of a perfect, orderly world. Certain goods became scarce without explanation. Instructions from the Council arrived late or vaguely, leaving communities to guess how to respond. Rumors began circulating quietly. Whispers about secret projects, hidden agendas, and plans that no one was meant to see. At first, these whispers were dismissed. People often blamed themselves for worrying, thinking they were imagining problems where none existed. One day, a man living in a mid-sized city noticed a peculiar change. The Council had announced new regulations that seemed minor at first glance. Limits on travel, adjustments to work hours, and restrictions on gatherings. But something about the way these rules were enforced felt different. There was a tension in the streets, an unspoken message in the eyes of guards patrolling neighborhoods. People walked faster, heads down, as if aware of an invisible pressure pressing down on them. The man observed families whispering to each other, glances full of worry passing silently between neighbors. Even in the quiet of homes, people could sense the undercurrent of unease. Many tried to convince themselves it was nothing serious, a temporary adjustment or a minor policy meant to protect them. Yet the unease lingered. It was subtle, like a shadow that stretched across the city without anyone quite noticing at first. In his own life, the man saw the small ways this shift affected others. A local teacher, once cheerful and patient, seemed distracted and anxious. Shopkeepers began locking their stores earlier than usual, as though expecting trouble. Even in simple interactions, a new edge appeared in people's voices. Hesitation, caution, a constant question of who could be trusted. The man began keeping a personal journal, noting the strange patterns he observed. He wrote down details of events, conversations he overheard, and inconsistencies in the Council's messages. At first it was a private habit, almost like keeping a diary, but slowly it became a form of protection, a way to remind himself that someone had to pay attention to the truth. People in the city were not alone in sensing these changes. Across the country, similar reports surfaced. Farmers complained about new limitations on the use of land. Workers spoke of unannounced audits at factories and offices, often leaving employees confused and fearful. Entire neighborhoods began forming informal networks of communication. Neighbors talking quietly over fences, shopkeepers passing notes discreetly, strangers asking cautious questions about events elsewhere. Fear was no longer invisible. It had become shared, a silent bond between ordinary people who sensed something was deeply wrong. Despite these signs, the majority of citizens still believed in the Council. They had been taught to trust the authority, to rely on it for guidance, and to see it as the guardian of peace. The idea that those in power could be acting against their interests felt almost impossible to accept. Most people clung to routine and habit, convincing themselves that whatever oddities they observed were temporary or misunderstandings. This trust created a fragile calm, a veneer of normalcy that hid the storm brewing beneath. The man's own family was part of this tension. His parents, practical and cautious, noticed his growing concern but warned him not to overthink things. His younger sibling, full of curiosity, asked questions he could not fully answer. Conversations around the dinner table often turned to everyday worries. Supplies, school, jobs. Rarely did they speak of politics or the Council's intentions, because the unspoken rule was that certain topics were unsafe. Even in a seemingly ordinary household, the air carried an invisible weight, a tension born from the faint but growing sense that life was no longer entirely under their control. In public spaces, the changes were even more noticeable. Street patrols became more frequent. their presence unsettling even if no one was directly threatened. Announcements on loudspeakers often contained instructions that seemed redundant or confusing, and yet failure to comply could result in questioning or reprimand. People adjusted their routines almost instinctively, taking different routes, avoiding areas known for heavy surveillance, speaking in quieter tones. Communities began to rely on one another in small ways, helping each other with errands, sharing news, and providing warnings about potential risks. The shared experience created an unspoken solidarity, though most people still did not fully understand the cause of their collective unease. Even in moments meant for relaxation, unease was present. Parks once filled with children playing and families enjoying the day seemed quieter. Public events were smaller, subdued, and marked by the same careful awareness of authority. People joked less freely, smiled less easily, and even laughter seemed measured. Those who noticed this subtle shift felt an odd combination of sorrow and vigilance, as if part of them knew that something fundamental was changing in the world around them. The man continued his careful observation, noticing small but important patterns. He saw how communities adjusted silently, how people learned to communicate without drawing attention, and how they shared information with discretion. In these acts, he saw hope and courage, though he did not yet understand how critical they would become. Each small act of awareness, each careful conversation, and each subtle warning formed a network of resilience that would later play a key role in confronting the challenges ahead. Though life seemed ordinary on the surface, a quiet revolution of consciousness was beginning. People were starting to notice discrepancies, question motives, and pay attention to details they once ignored. Their trust in the council remained intact in many ways, but cracks were forming. The sense of calm that had dominated daily life was fragile, vulnerable to the revelation of truths that had been hidden for too long. The man could not predict what would happen next, but he felt a growing sense of urgency. Each day, the small signs of change became impossible to ignore. The atmosphere in the city, in his family, and in communities everywhere carried the weight of anticipation, fear, and a subtle determination that was still unnamed. In that quiet tension, humanity was unknowingly preparing for a moment that would change everything. A moment when the truth about the council's intentions would no longer be a secret. At this stage, the world was poised between ordinary life and the unknown. People went about their routines, still smiling, still working, still hoping that tomorrow would be like today. Yet beneath the surface, the subtle currents of change moved steadily, like an invisible river shaping the land. The man's observations, his quiet notes, and his growing awareness were part of a larger awakening. A small but critical spark in a world that was about to face the first real test of its trust, courage, and unity. And so life continued, seemingly normal but quietly shifting. Humanity moved forward, unaware that the calm was temporary, that shadows were gathering, and that soon every citizen would be forced to confront the reality that the very people they trusted most might not have their best interests at heart. The stage was set. The tension had begun, and the story of betrayal, resistance, and human resilience was quietly, inexorably coming to life. The revelation came like a thunderclap, sudden and impossible to ignore. For years, humanity had trusted the council, believing it acted in the best interest of everyone. They had been told that decisions were made to keep people safe, to manage resources fairly, and to prevent conflicts. But the truth was far darker than anyone could have imagined. The first signs of betrayal appeared in documents that were leaked from within the council's inner offices. These papers revealed plans and strategies designed not to protect humanity, but to control it. Entire populations were being manipulated for the council's own gain. Resources were being hoarded, information distorted, and dissent crushed silently before it could reach the public. What shocked people most was not only the scale of the deception, but also the deliberate effort to hide it for so long. News of the leak spread rapidly. Social networks, community gatherings, and even public squares became filled with people discussing what had been discovered. For some, the shock was overwhelming. They could not reconcile the leaders they had trusted with the betrayal that now seemed undeniable. Families argued over what to believe, neighbors questioned one another, and entire communities struggled to process the sudden collapse of trust. The man who had been observing the changes in Part 1 felt a wave of both fear and resolve. Everything he had noted, the strange rules, the secretive patrols, the hidden communications, suddenly made sense in a horrifying way. The council had not been acting out of caution or concern. It had been acting out of self-interest, quietly ensuring its own power while the rest of humanity remained in the dark. People's reactions varied. Some felt numb, unable to comprehend the scope of the betrayal. Others were consumed by anger, demanding justice and immediate answers. Protests began forming in small numbers, quickly growing as the leaked documents circulated. Ordinary citizens who had once accepted the council's authority without question now found themselves questioning every law, every announcement, every directive. Every decision the council had made suddenly seemed suspicious, every restriction a potential act of manipulation. For many, the betrayal felt personal. People had trusted the council with their lives, their futures, and the safety of their families. Some had dedicated years of their lives to supporting its programs, believing they were helping their communities thrive. To learn that the same authority had secretly worked against them was a devastating shock. Parents worried for their children, workers questioned the integrity of their jobs, and students doubted the education that had been provided under the council's guidance. The man watched as communities reacted in different ways. In some neighborhoods, people gathered in town halls and community centers to discuss the revelations. Conversations were intense but respectful, as citizens tried to make sense of what they had learned. In other areas, anger boiled over into heated arguments and even acts of vandalism. The sense of betrayal was universal, but the ways in which people processed it varied widely. One striking observation was how quickly ordinary citizens began to take action. People who had never protested or spoken out before found themselves organizing gatherings, sharing verified information, and strategizing ways to respond. There was a sense of urgency in the air, a feeling that time was running out before the council could take further steps to secure its control. The man felt a mixture of pride and anxiety as he witnessed the courage of people around him. In the midst of the chaos, small acts of bravery stood out. A group of workers quietly documented evidence of resource hoarding, risking severe punishment to ensure the truth was not erased. Families shared food and supplies with neighbors, preparing for the possibility that the council might tighten restrictions further. Children, too young to fully understand the political implications, began noticing the fear and determination in the adults around them. These small human actions created threads of hope that ran through the wider tapestry of fear and anger. The council did not respond to the revelations with transparency or apology. Instead, it attempted to discredit the leak and those who circulated it. Official statements dismissed the documents as fabricated or misunderstood, and broadcasts urged citizens to remain calm and trust the authority. But the damage had already been done. People had seen the evidence with their own eyes, and the carefully maintained trust that had allowed the council to operate for decades was shattered. Rumors spread quickly, fueled by fear and uncertainty. Some claimed that entire cities were already under secret surveillance, that the council had informants in every community. Others insisted that more shocking revelations were yet to come, hinting at projects and plans that were even more sinister. While some of these claims were exaggerated, the overall effect was undeniable. Humanity was awake, alert, and unwilling to be deceived any longer. Amid this growing unrest, the man became aware of a new feeling: responsibility. He had once been an observer, quietly documenting anomalies and inconsistencies. Now he felt compelled to act. He began sharing information with neighbors, organizing small groups to discuss strategies, and connecting with people in nearby towns who had also discovered the truth. Each conversation, each plan, strengthened the growing movement of ordinary citizens determined to resist the council's manipulation. Despite the rising anger, there was a careful sense of strategy. People realized that rash actions could be dangerous. The council had power, resources, and surveillance. Any direct confrontation could put lives at risk. Instead, citizens worked to gather evidence, share knowledge discreetly, and prepare for the moment when they could collectively demand accountability. The tension between caution and urgency created a careful, deliberate approach to resistance, guided by both fear and determination. The man also observed the personal toll of the betrayal. People suffered emotionally, struggling to cope with the realization that those they had trusted most had acted against them. Anxiety, sleepless nights, and constant worry became common. Families argued over what to do next, and communities had to find ways to comfort one another. Yet within this pain, a stronger sense of unity began to emerge. People leaned on each other, realizing that survival and justice required collaboration and mutual support. As the days passed, the resistance grew more organized. Citizens established networks for sharing information and coordinating actions. Secret meetings were held to plan strategies, educate communities about their rights, and ensure that no one acted alone in confronting the council. Ordinary people became leaders not because they sought power, but because the moment demanded courage and initiative. The man witnessed people stepping into roles they had never imagined for themselves, motivated by the urgent need to protect their fellow citizens and reclaim their autonomy. By the end of the first week following the revelation, the world had changed irreversibly. Humanity was no longer passive. Trust in the council was gone, replaced by vigilance, anger, and determination. Communities were waking up to the reality that they were responsible for their own fate, and the lesson was clear. They could no longer rely blindly on those in power. Every person, from the youngest child to the oldest elder, was touched by the betrayal, and every person had a role to play in shaping the future. The man reflected on what he had witnessed. He saw fear, yes, but also courage. He saw despair, but also determination. He saw ordinary people stepping into extraordinary roles, learning to fight not with weapons alone, but with truth, solidarity, and careful planning. Humanity's rage had begun to boil, and it was no longer something that could be contained. Even as the council tried to maintain control, the seeds of resistance had taken root. Every conversation, every act of courage, every shared piece of information strengthened the growing movement. People began to believe in themselves, in their communities, and in the idea that the council could be held accountable. The betrayal had ignited something profound, a recognition of human strength, resilience, and the refusal to accept injustice. And so, the world moved forward not as it had before, but as something transformed. The calm that had existed for decades was gone, replaced by tension, awareness, and the burning desire for justice. Humanity was no longer blind. It had seen the truth, and the response was inevitable. The stage was set for a confrontation that would test courage, unity, and the very spirit of the people. The man continued to document, to observe, and to act, but he was no longer alone. Around him, ordinary citizens, once quiet and obedient, were waking up, finding their voices and preparing for the struggle that lay ahead. Betrayal had been revealed, trust had been broken, and anger had ignited. The story of humanity's awakening, and its fight to reclaim what was rightfully theirs, was only just beginning.
After the shocking revelation of the council's betrayal, humanity could no longer remain passive. The anger that had begun simmering in the hearts of citizens was transforming into determination, a determination to act and reclaim control over their own lives. Across cities, towns, and rural areas, people were awakening to the reality that trust and authority could no longer be taken for granted. In many places, small groups began to form. Neighbors who had once exchanged polite greetings were now meeting quietly to discuss what the council's betrayal truly meant. They shared observations, news, and pieces of evidence that had circulated from the leak. The conversations were cautious at first, because fear of reprisal was still strong, but the urgency of the situation pushed people to overcome hesitation. The man who had been observing these developments felt a sense of pride and hope. Ordinary people were beginning to take responsibility not just for themselves, but for their communities. These groups started with small actions. They shared verified information discreetly, making sure that as many people as possible understood the truth without exposing themselves to danger. Some individuals risked traveling between towns to deliver evidence personally, bypassing the council's attempts to control communication. Others taught their neighbors how to read official messages critically, to spot inconsistencies, and to question directives that seemed self-serving. Every small act built a network of awareness, a foundation on which larger resistance could grow. The man noticed that courage was becoming contagious. When one person acted bravely, others felt empowered to do the same. People who had previously been fearful of standing out began to speak up, share news, and organize discreet meetings. Communities were learning that the power of the council relied not only on secrecy, but also on the assumption that people would remain obedient. By breaking that silence, humanity was beginning to reclaim its strength. Even as anger grew, there was a careful sense of strategy forming. People realized that rash actions could backfire, that confronting the council directly without preparation could result in punishment or worse. So resistance was built step by step, quietly and deliberately. They organized ways to protect each other, ensured that no one acted alone, and carefully mapped out who could be trusted. Trust had been shattered by betrayal, but slowly it was being rebuilt within these new networks. The man took note of the personal sacrifices that were already being made. Farmers shared extra food with those who could not grow their own. Shopkeepers provided supplies at lower prices or even for free, understanding that the fight was about more than profit. Families sheltered messengers and activists, providing safe spaces for those working to expose the council's secrets. The effort was collective, and the realization that survival depended on unity was becoming clear to everyone involved. As these groups grew stronger, they began to establish communication systems that were more resilient than the council could easily disrupt. People developed coded messages, passed information through trusted couriers, and used subtle signals in public to indicate when it was safe to speak freely. These systems allowed ordinary citizens to coordinate without drawing attention, creating a quiet but powerful web of resistance that stretched across regions. The man observed how the anger of humanity was being channeled into meaningful action. Instead of destructive impulses, people were turning their rage into determination and purpose. Communities planned public demonstrations to make their voices heard, prepared petitions to demand transparency, and organized efforts to ensure that hidden abuses of power were exposed. There was a sense of discipline emerging, a realization that the fight for justice required careful thought as much as courage. Even children, too young to fully understand politics, were affected by the growing sense of awareness. They noticed the seriousness in adults' voices, the cautious glances exchanged between neighbors, and the quiet preparation that seemed to fill the air. In subtle ways, they learned the importance of observation, the value of truth, and the power of standing together in the face of injustice. The man often watched families in conversation, realizing that this awakening was not just political, it was human, touching hearts and minds across generations. Amid the organized efforts, fear was never far away. People knew the council still had resources, control over communications, and the ability to enforce harsh punishments. Yet the growing solidarity provided a sense of security. The knowledge that they were not alone, that countless others were quietly resisting, gave people the courage to act. This combination of caution, awareness, and collective effort became the foundation of humanity's organized resistance. The man began taking an active role in coordinating some of these efforts. He shared knowledge about the council's patterns, observed where enforcement was strongest, and helped connect groups who had not yet met. Every connection strengthened the movement, every plan enhanced their ability to respond strategically. He understood that the resistance was not just about exposing the council, it was about preparing humanity for the challenges that lay ahead. As weeks passed, the movement became more sophisticated. Citizens began documenting every instance of the council's abuse, creating records that could not be easily erased. They gathered photographs, reports, and testimonies, ensuring that the truth would be undeniable when it was finally revealed to the wider population. This meticulous work required patience, but it was essential. Humanity had learned that courage alone was not enough. Preparation, strategy, and careful planning were just as important in the struggle for justice. The man noticed that these actions were changing people. Ordinary citizens were developing leadership skills, learning to negotiate, and discovering the strength they had never realized existed within themselves. Fear was still present, but it no longer paralyzed them. Instead, it became a guide, helping them act with caution and intelligence. People were learning that the council's power depended on their obedience, and that by refusing to comply blindly, they could reclaim control over their lives. Alongside this growing strength, a sense of solidarity deepened. Communities that had once been isolated now worked together, sharing resources, intelligence, and strategies. Trust, once broken by betrayal, was being rebuilt through small, consistent actions. People learned to rely on each other in ways they had never imagined, recognizing that unity was their greatest defense against the council's manipulation. Even as the movement grew, the man could see that anger had not yet been fully unleashed. People were still organizing, planning, and preparing, holding back the full force of their outrage until the moment was right. This restraint was crucial. The council remained dangerous, and reckless action could lead to widespread harm. Humanity's rage was boiling under the surface, contained but potent, ready to drive change when the time came. The man also observed the role of communication in this organized resistance. Word of mouth, written notes, and discreet meetings became lifelines for communities. People learned to convey information without exposing themselves, to share warnings about council movements, and to spread knowledge about safe practices. Communication became a tool of survival, a method of building trust, and a way of connecting ordinary citizens in a network that the council could not easily dismantle. In these moments, ordinary actions became extraordinary. A neighbor offering a place to meet safely, a teacher guiding students in critical thinking, a shopkeeper sharing news discreetly, these acts, seemingly small, were building the backbone of a movement that would soon challenge the council directly. The man understood that heroism did not always come from grand gestures. Often, it emerged from the quiet, consistent choices of ordinary people determined to protect themselves and those around them. By the end of the month, humanity's organized resistance had become a force to reckon with. Communities across regions were connected, informed, and prepared. Citizens had learned how to protect each other, share information, and plan collectively. They were no longer passive observers of the council's actions. They were participants in shaping their own future. The anger that had been simmering was now a controlled, directed force, capable of achieving change without succumbing to chaos. The man reflected on the journey so far. Humanity had moved from shock and disbelief to awareness, from anger to careful organization. People had discovered courage they did not know they possessed, forming networks of trust and cooperation that would be crucial in the struggles ahead. They were learning that true power did not lie in authority alone, but in the willingness of ordinary individuals to act together for justice and truth. And yet, the man knew the fight was only beginning. The council remained in control, still wielding immense power, and the challenges ahead would test humanity's courage, unity, and resilience. The organized resistance was strong, but it was still vulnerable. Every plan, every strategy, and every act of courage would be needed in the days to come. Humanity's rage had been organized, but the real confrontation with betrayal and injustice had not yet arrived. In this critical stage, the man continued to play his part. He observed, documented, and connected people across communities. He saw ordinary citizens transform into leaders, teachers, and protectors. He saw fear give way to purpose, despair replace.
The tension that had been quietly building for weeks was now impossible to ignore. Humanity's anger, once simmering beneath the surface, had begun to take shape in tangible ways. Communities that had been quietly resisting the council now faced their first major confrontations. It was no longer just a matter of sharing information or preparing for the future. The struggle had arrived at their doorsteps. The man had never expected to see such a rapid escalation. What had begun as cautious observation and quiet coordination had grown into open defiance, and the council was reacting. Enforcement teams moved through towns and cities with increased visibility, patrolling streets more frequently, inspecting businesses and questioning citizens. The subtle fear that had once been background noise was now a constant, pressing presence. Yet rather than cowing people, these actions fueled their determination. In one city, a group of neighbors gathered quietly in a community hall to discuss the council's latest measures. The man was among them, observing how ordinary people were organizing. They spoke in hushed tones, aware that even walls had ears, sharing news of patrol movements, resource hoarding, and planned restrictions. The air was tense, but there was also an unmistakable sense of unity. People were realizing that their survival depended on both courage and strategy, and they were ready to face the risks together. The confrontations began with small but significant acts of defiance. Shopkeepers refused to comply with unjust regulations, offering goods to those in need despite warnings. Farmers ignored restrictions on land use, ensuring that communities would not go hungry. Students and teachers spoke openly in educational settings about the council's betrayal, spreading awareness even as they risked punishment. Every act of defiance was a statement, a refusal to accept the council's control without question. The man noticed that fear still played a role. but it no longer paralyzed action. People were learning to act with caution while standing firm. They developed signals to warn each other about approaching patrols, shared safe routes for communication, and created contingency plans in case confrontations escalated. Courage was tempered by intelligence, and ordinary citizens were becoming experts in navigating the dangers imposed by the council. One evening, the man witnessed a particularly tense confrontation. A group of citizens had gathered in a public square to distribute food and resources to families affected by new restrictions. Council enforcement teams arrived, demanding compliance and threatening punishment. For a moment, it seemed as though fear would take over, and the crowd would disperse. But the citizens held their ground. They explained their actions calmly, appealing to the basic rights of people to protect themselves and their families. The standoff lasted hours, with neither side willing to back down completely. During that confrontation, the man saw ordinary people act with extraordinary courage. Parents shielded their children. Elderly citizens refused to leave without witnessing. Accountability and young adults coordinated quietly to prevent the situation from turning violent. The calm, deliberate resistance surprised the council's enforcement teams, who had expected submission rather than steadfast defiance. By the end of the night, the citizens had not been punished, but the confrontation had sent a clear message. Humanity would not be intimidated easily. Across other regions, similar events unfolded. Communities that had been preparing for weeks now tested their readiness. They organized meetings, shared intelligence, and ensured that vulnerable members were protected. Resistance was no longer scattered or secretive. It was coordinated and purposeful. The council's attempts to maintain control were increasingly met with strategic opposition, as ordinary citizens refused to allow fear to dictate their actions. The man observed the emotional toll these confrontations took on people. Fear, anxiety, and anger were present, but so was pride. Citizens were discovering the power of their collective action, and the knowledge that they could challenge authority without surrendering their values gave them strength. Families leaned on each other, neighbors offered support, and communities became tighter knit in the face of shared struggle. Humanity's response was shaping not just the present, but the very fabric of society itself. In towns where resources were scarce due to the council's hoarding, people became inventive. They shared skills, pooled resources, and created informal networks of aid. Mechanics, farmers, and artisans offered their services freely, ensuring that everyone could continue their daily lives while still participating in resistance efforts. The man realized that these small acts of solidarity were as powerful as any protest or demonstration. They strengthened trust, built resilience, and demonstrated that humanity could thrive even under pressure. The confrontations were not without risk. Some citizens faced arrests, fines, or harassment, and the man witnessed the council's enforcement teams using intimidation tactics to try to break the morale of the people. Yet these risks did not deter the movement. They hardened it. Each act of resistance became a lesson in courage and strategy, teaching communities how to anticipate challenges and respond effectively. People learned to balance assertiveness with discretion, understanding that survival required both bravery and wisdom. During this period, the man also observed the emergence of leadership among ordinary citizens. Individuals who had once lived quiet, unassuming lives now stepped forward to organize meetings, mediate disputes, and guide collective action. Leadership was no longer about authority or position. It was about service, empathy, and the ability to inspire courage in others. Communities were learning that everyone had a role to play, and that effective resistance relied on collaboration rather than hierarchy. The first major confrontations had another unexpected effect. They galvanized wider networks of resistance. Towns and cities that had been isolated began sharing intelligence and strategies. People realized that the council's control depended on division and fear, and that unity was their strongest defense. Communication networks grew stronger, messages traveled more quickly, and communities coordinated in ways that the council could not easily disrupt. Humanity's rage was no longer scattered. It was focused, strategic, and increasingly powerful. Even in moments of rest, the man could see that people were learning and adapting. They reflected on what had worked, what had failed, and how to prepare for future encounters. Children noticed the seriousness in adults' faces, learning the value of courage, critical thinking, and cooperation. The next generation was absorbing lessons in resilience, strategy, and human solidarity, often without even realizing it. By the end of the first month of open confrontations, humanity had demonstrated something remarkable. The Council's power was not absolute. Ordinary people, when united by shared purpose and careful planning, could challenge authority and assert their rights. The confrontations had tested courage, strengthened trust, and shown that coordinated action was possible even in the face of overwhelming odds. The man reflected on how far humanity had come since the betrayal had first been revealed. Shock and anger had transformed into awareness, organization, and deliberate resistance. Communities had discovered new strengths, new leaders had emerged, and ordinary citizens had begun to realize that their actions mattered. The confrontations had been difficult and risky, but they had also forged a sense of empowerment that could not be easily undone. Even as the Council continued to assert its control, humanity had learned important lessons. They understood the value of unity, the power of careful planning, and the necessity of courage tempered by strategy. Fear remained, but it was no longer paralyzing. It was a guide helping people act with prudence and determination. Humanity had begun to reclaim control over its own destiny, not through violence alone, but through resilience, solidarity, and unwavering commitment to justice. The man knew that these first confrontations were only the beginning. The Council would not easily relinquish power, and the challenges ahead would be greater and more dangerous. But humanity had proven something essential, that ordinary people, when aware, united, and courageous, could stand against even the most entrenched authority. The confrontations had revealed the strength of the collective, the resilience of communities, and the human spirit's refusal to accept betrayal without resistance. And so, life moved forward in this tense, uncertain period. Streets were alive with both fear and determination. Neighborhoods remained vigilant, sharing information, protecting vulnerable members, and preparing for whatever the Council might do next. Ordinary citizens had become extraordinary through their courage and coordination, and the man observed it all with both awe and hope. Humanity's rage, once silent, had now become a deliberate, focused force capable of challenging injustice. The confrontations had also sparked a new sense of identity among people. They were no longer passive subjects of authority. They were participants in shaping their future. The lessons learned through fear, strategy, and collective action would carry them forward, preparing them for the larger struggles yet to come. The Council might still hold outward control, but humanity had reclaimed its heart, and that heart beat with courage, unity, and the determination to prevail. By the end of this period, the man saw that humanity's struggle had transformed from mere survival into a fight for Jew. The months of planning, coordination, and careful defiance were finally beginning to bear fruit. Humanity, once divided and fearful, was now starting to reclaim control from the Council. What had begun as whispers, secret meetings, and small acts of resistance had grown into a movement capable of challenging authority in meaningful ways. Ordinary people, once silent observers, were now active participants in shaping their future. The man watched as communities celebrated small victories that, though subtle, carried immense significance. Farmers who had resisted the Council's restrictions were now able to distribute food freely across towns, ensuring no family went hungry. Shopkeepers, who had once feared punishment for defying orders, were now openly supplying necessary goods to those in need. Each act, seemingly minor on its own, was part of a larger wave of reclamation, a declaration that humanity would no longer be manipulated or controlled. Communication networks that had once been secretive were now thriving. Messages traveled swiftly across cities and rural areas, connecting communities that had never met before. Citizens shared intelligence about the Council's movements, coordinated resource distribution, and ensured that no group acted alone. This growing network was not just a tool of resistance. It was a lifeline, a demonstration that unity and solidarity were far stronger than fear. The man saw that courage had become contagious. Individuals who had once hesitated to act now stepped forward to lead, to organize, and to protect others. Ordinary citizens were becoming leaders out of necessity, and their actions inspired countless others. Neighborhoods that had previously relied solely on whispers and cautious observation were now active hubs of strategy and coordination. Each community was contributing to a collective effort that no single authority could easily suppress. One of the first significant victories came in the form of information control. Citizens uncovered hidden resources, secret council projects, and evidence of corruption that had previously been inaccessible. Teams of volunteers documented every detail, photographed records, and compiled testimonies from those who had suffered under the council's policies. This wealth of information was shared widely, creating a clear, undeniable picture of the council's actions. For the first time, the general public could see exactly how deeply betrayal had affected their lives. The man noticed that the psychological impact of these victories was profound. People who had felt powerless and frightened were now emboldened. Each small success reinforced the belief that change was possible, and that collective action could overcome even the most entrenched authority. Families, neighbors, and communities began to trust in each other more fully, knowing that their combined efforts could lead to meaningful results. Communities also developed practical systems to ensure their independence. Food distribution networks, medical support groups, and educational initiatives operated without relying on the council's oversight. People shared skills and resources freely, learning to depend on one another rather than a corrupt authority. These actions were not just about survival. They were about reclaiming autonomy, restoring dignity, and demonstrating that humanity could thrive when united. The man observed acts of heroism in everyday life. A teacher risked punishment to provide education about the council's betrayal, empowering students to think critically. A mechanic and a farmer coordinated to supply essential tools and produce to struggling families. Children, too, played a small but important role, delivering messages, observing patterns, and helping maintain communication between neighbors. These acts, simple yet courageous, created a web of resilience that strengthened the entire movement. Meanwhile, the council began to realize that its control was slipping. Their attempts to intimidate citizens were met with resistance. Their propaganda was ignored or exposed, and their enforcement teams increasingly faced organized defiance. What had once been isolated incidents of rebellion had grown into coordinated campaigns that the council could not easily suppress. The man understood that the balance of power was shifting, and that humanity was entering a critical phase where careful planning and unity would determine the outcome. Strategic thinking became essential. Communities learned to anticipate the council's moves to protect vulnerable members and to coordinate large-scale efforts. Citizens shared intelligence on patrol schedules, resource hoarding, and potential threats, allowing the movement to respond proactively rather than reactively. The man noted that this level of organization was unprecedented. Ordinary people, when motivated by justice and shared purpose, were capable of planning and executing actions that rivaled the authority they opposed. One particularly inspiring event demonstrated the power of collective action. Several towns collaborated to expose a major council project designed to exploit resources unfairly. Volunteers risked their safety to gather evidence, transport it safely, and present it to the wider population. Citizens from neighboring towns helped protect the couriers, coordinate meetings, and ensure that the information reached everyone. When the news finally spread, communities celebrated not just the exposure of corruption, but the demonstration of their own strength. Humanity had proven that it could act decisively and effectively when united. The man noticed that these victories were changing people internally as well. Fear and despair were giving way to confidence and purpose. Ordinary citizens had discovered resilience they did not know they possessed, and their self-belief inspired others to take part. Communities began to see themselves not just as victims of betrayal, but as active agents of change. The psychological transformation was as important as the physical victories. They had regained faith in their own abilities and in each other. Even as these successes unfolded, challenges remained. The council still held resources, influence, and a capacity for enforcement. Some enforcement teams acted aggressively, attempting to intimidate or suppress resistance. Citizens responded carefully, using intelligence, coordination, and unity to mitigate risk while continuing to push forward. The man realized that the struggle was far from over, but humanity was now prepared in ways it had never been before. solidarity became the movement's greatest strength. Communities that had once been isolated learned to support each other through shared resources, knowledge, and encouragement. Leaders emerged organically, guiding efforts without seeking personal gain. Families protected neighbors, volunteers risked punishment to deliver essential information, and communities created safe spaces for planning and education. This growing network of cooperation made humanity resilient, adaptive, and difficult to suppress. One of the most significant changes was the reclamation of public spaces. Squares, marketplaces, and community halls, once dominated by fear and council control, became centers of organization and communication. Citizens held meetings, distributed resources, and shared news. Public spaces transformed from sites of compliance to symbols of empowerment. The man saw people taking pride in their ability to shape the environment around them, to assert control over their own lives, and to demonstrate that unity could overcome fear. As humanity continued to reclaim control, the psychological impact on the council became apparent. Their attempts to maintain dominance were increasingly ineffective. Propaganda lost credibility, enforcement teams faced organized resistance, and citizens openly defied restrictions. The balance of power had shifted. While the council still held outward authority, the true control had moved to the people. Humanity had reclaimed its agency, proving that collective action and shared purpose could challenge even entrenched systems of power. The man reflected on the journey so far. From the first whispers of betrayal to the organized resistance and now to tangible victories, humanity had transformed. Ordinary citizens had discovered courage, resourcefulness, and resilience. Communities had learned to cooperate, strategize, and protect one another. The betrayal had ignited a force that no threat could easily extinguish, a force built on unity, justice, and determination. He also noticed the role of small personal actions. Every volunteer, every family that shared resources, every individual who acted courageously had contributed to these victories. The collective effort demonstrated that heroism was not limited to grand gestures. It could be found in everyday acts of courage and solidarity. Humanity's strength was the sum of countless small actions, each one building toward a larger impact. By the end of this period, humanity had achieved something remarkable. They had exposed corruption, redistributed resources, protected vulnerable communities, and demonstrated their ability to act strategically and decisively. Ordinary people had become extraordinary in their courage and coordination. The council's grip had weakened, and humanity had reclaimed the moral and practical high ground. Yet, the man knew the struggle was not over. The council would not accept defeat easily, and challenges lay ahead that would test courage, unity, and resilience. But humanity had proven that it could face danger with intelligence, solidarity, and unwavering determination. They had shown that betrayal and oppression could be met with organization, courage, and collective action. Humanity's victories, though hard-won, were more than just practical successes. They represented a reclaiming of dignity, self-determination, and trust in one another. Communities had The
months of struggle, planning, and courage had finally led humanity to a turning point. Communities, once fearful and divided, had become strong, organized, and determined. The council, which had long ruled with authority and secrecy, now faced the undeniable force of people united by truth, resilience, and a shared desire for justice. The man observed the transformation around him with a mixture of awe and hope. Ordinary citizens who had once been silent observers had become leaders, educators, protectors, and organizers. Families and neighbors had developed systems of support, ensuring that no one faced danger or scarcity alone. Communities had discovered skills and resourcefulness that had lain dormant for generations, and their collective courage had reshaped the balance of power. With the council's influence weakening, citizens began to reclaim public spaces that had long been dominated by fear and control. Squares, marketplaces, and community halls were filled with conversation, planning, and laughter, a sign that the human spirit could not be subdued. These spaces became centers of empowerment, where ideas were shared, strategies were discussed, and support was offered freely. People realized that true strength lay in cooperation and unity, and they embraced it fully. The man watched as small symbolic victories inspired larger movements. In one town, a group of citizens reopened a school that had been shut down due to restrictions. Teachers and parents worked together to ensure that every child had access to education, sharing lessons not only in academics, but in critical thinking and civic responsibility. The school became a symbol of resilience, demonstrating that humanity could rebuild even in the face of betrayal and oppression. Similarly, communities began to establish networks of resource sharing that were more efficient than any system the council had enforced. Farmers and artisans collaborated to provide food, tools, and essential goods to those in need, creating a self-sufficient cycle of support. People learned to rely on each other rather than a corrupt authority, and the sense of empowerment was tangible. Ordinary citizens were no longer dependent. They were self-reliant, connected, and capable. The man also noticed the emotional transformation taking place. Fear, anxiety, and despair that had once dominated communities were gradually replaced by confidence, optimism, and a renewed sense of purpose. People smiled again, laughed together, and celebrated small successes. They had faced betrayal and manipulation, yet they had emerged stronger and more united than ever before. The emotional resilience of humanity was as remarkable as its practical victories. In these months, leadership emerged naturally. Those with knowledge, courage, and empathy guided communities, not for personal gain, but for the well-being of all. Leaders were respected for their service, honesty, and ability to inspire others. Ordinary citizens who had once felt powerless realized that leadership was not about position or authority. It was about action, responsibility, and the willingness to stand for what was right. The man observed the role of communication in this transformation. People shared knowledge freely, ensuring that everyone was aware of strategies, potential threats, and opportunities for cooperation. Networks of couriers, meetings, and signals allowed communities to coordinate efficiently and effectively. These networks were not just tools for resistance, they were instruments for building trust, solidarity, and collective wisdom. Humanity had learned that communication was a form of power, and they wielded it responsibly. The Council, sensing that its control was slipping, attempted to reassert dominance. Enforcement teams patrolled streets more aggressively, propaganda campaigns were launched, and attempts were made to sow division among communities. Yet each of these efforts was met with coordinated response. Citizens anticipated these moves, protected vulnerable members, and continued their activities with greater determination. The man realized that the Council's power depended on fear and isolation, and once those were removed, its authority crumbled. One of the most significant milestones was the exposure of the Council's remaining secrets. Citizens uncovered hidden projects, financial manipulations, and manipulative policies designed to control the population. Teams of volunteers documented and shared this information widely, ensuring that the public could no longer be deceived. The transparency created accountability, and the Council's credibility eroded further. Humanity had reclaimed the truth, and with it, the ability to shape its own destiny. The man noticed that this phase of triumph was not about revenge, it was about justice, fairness, and rebuilding. Communities did not seek to punish blindly. Instead, they focused on restoring balance and ensuring that betrayal could not happen again. Systems of oversight, cooperation, and mutual responsibility were being established. People learned that true power lay not in control over others, but in the ability to act ethically, responsibly, and collaboratively. Families played a crucial role in this reconstruction. Parents, grandparents, and children worked together to repair communities, teach values of trust and solidarity, and support one another emotionally. Children, who had grown up witnessing courage and resilience, learned the importance of critical thinking, empathy, and action. The man realized that the lessons of betrayal, resistance, and triumph would be carried forward by the next generation, creating a lasting culture of awareness and empowerment. As communities rebuilt, the man observed the creation of new forms of governance, ones that were participatory, transparent, and accountable. Decisions were made collectively, with input from those affected, ensuring that no single authority could manipulate or exploit the people again. Citizens developed committees, councils, and networks that operated openly and honestly. Humanity had learned from betrayal and had chosen a path rooted in integrity, fairness, and shared responsibility. The man also saw the power of collaboration between communities. Towns that had once been isolated now shared resources, knowledge, and expertise freely. Trade networks, educational exchanges, and cooperative projects flourished. Humanity had discovered that unity and interdependence were stronger than fear and manipulation. The collective spirit had grown beyond individual communities, creating a network of mutual support that spanned regions. During this time, the psychological impact of victory became evident. People walked with confidence, spoke openly, and no longer felt the weight of oppression. Trust, once broken, had been rebuilt through consistent, shared action. Communities were more resilient, compassionate, and proactive. Humanity had not only survived betrayal, it had transformed the experience into a source of strength and wisdom. The man reflected on how far humanity had come. From the first moments of shock and disbelief, through organized resistance, confrontations, and small victories, to the final reclamation of autonomy and dignity, the journey had been arduous but transformative. Ordinary citizens had become extraordinary through courage, unity, and persistent action. They had proven that even in the face of betrayal and oppression, humanity could rise, rebuild, and thrive. Even as life stabilized, the man noticed a new awareness among people. They understood the fragility of trust and the importance of vigilance. Education, transparency, and cooperation were no longer optional. They were essential. Communities implemented systems to prevent future betrayal, ensuring that the mistakes of the past would not be repeated. Humanity had learned to guard itself not with fear, but with wisdom, integrity, and solidarity. One particularly inspiring development was the focus on future generations. Education programs emphasized critical thinking, civic responsibility, and ethical decision-making. Children and young adults were taught not only practical skills but also the importance of honesty, empathy, and cooperation. The man realized that this investment in human potential would ensure that the lessons of betrayal and resistance were carried forward, creating a culture of resilience and empowerment for years to come. At the same time, humanity celebrated its achievements. Public ceremonies, communal meals, and shared festivals marked the transition from fear to empowerment. These celebrations were not about triumph over others. They were about acknowledging collective courage, resilience, and the spirit of cooperation. Communities recognized the contributions of every individual, from volunteers and leaders to families and children. The man saw that these moments of joy reinforced solidarity and inspired continued vigilance. Humanity's rage, once a force of anger and confusion, had been transformed into determination, wisdom, and proactive action. The betrayal that had sparked fear had ultimately catalyzed growth, unity, and empowerment. Ordinary people had discovered their capacity to lead, protect, and rebuild, and communities had created systems that ensured fairness, accountability, and resilience. The lessons learned were not fleeting. They would shape culture, governance, and human relationships for generations. The man watched the final stages of this transformation with quiet pride. Humanity had reclaimed control over its own destiny, not through blind obedience, violence, or revenge, but through courage, strategy, cooperation, and ethical action. Communities were stronger, citizens were empowered, and the next generation was prepared to carry forward the values of justice, transparency, and solidarity. The world was still imperfect, but it was now guided by principles that respected human dignity and potential. In the night.